Today I'm joined on our panel with three distinguished members of our community. I have to my left Ruth O'Hare. She is a retired nurse, worked in obstetrics for 25 years. I have Assistant Chief Kurt Beatty with the Laconia Fire Department. You've been there for
almost 19 years.
19 years, and I have with me Officer Gary Allen, who is a patrol officer. Also, he has a specialized designation as a drug recognition expert, and he's been with Laconia for 5 years and Pembroke before that for 5 years. So I'm glad to see they're here. I'm glad that they could be with us to talk about some of the issues that our community is facing today. Before I get started, I just wanted to give a plug to Stand Up Laconia. Stand Up Laconia is a grassroots coalition that myself and several members of our community are currently involved with. Ruth is a member of that coalition as well. That our sole goal in the community is to bring recognition of the problems, i.e. the drug and alcohol issues that our community is facing, what we're doing to eradicate it from our city, and to bring options, alternatives to the drug and alcohol problem. Some of the things that are coming up for us, and if you have any interest in being involved with that, please contact myself through the Laconia Police Department, Chief Adams through the Laconia Police Department. You can also check with Claire Pearson, who is the one of their chairpersons from the Stand Up Laconia. But we have on December 8th, which is our sticker shock. This will be our second annual attempt at this. This is an opportunity for our youth to be involved with one of the biggest drugs that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is alcohol. And they're going to go out to local businesses and bring awareness to the dangers of alcohol. And they go out and they put some stickers on the products with the assistance of community members. We had a lot of success last year. I think we've talked somewhere in the neighborhood of around 10,000 stickers were placed on products at our local stores. That's coming up on December 8th. We also have another program that we're really pushing for the beginning of the year. It's called Lock It Up. And it runs in conjunction with the National Lock It Up, which is for firearm safety. But this is Lock It Up for the keeping your medication away from our youth. Locking it up so that it's used for the purpose it was intended and not to get into the hands of our youth and or someone that might want to get into your home and get those medications. And for those of you who are interested in finding out more about Stand Up Laconia, you can go to our Facebook page. But even better, come to our meeting. It'll be, our next one is on the 19th of November. It is held at the Hewitt Technical Center, which is next door to the high school, in the dining room. Lots of people there are involved. A lot of people are wanting to get involved or want to know how they get involved in their community and in helping with this problem that we face. So if you want to be involved, we have avenues for you to be involved, so we encourage you to come and participate in that. As we get started today with the panel, I'm going to turn most of the time over to them so that they can talk to you. But I did want to bring up some statistics that maybe the community members are not aware of. Since January 1st of this year, Laconia police have responded to 77 overdoses, and those aren't necessarily overdoses where people have passed away, but overdoses on medication, alcohol, and these are typically deliberate overdoses. Some are accidental, but 77. As of today's date, we've had 10 overdose deaths in the city of Laconia. Obviously, one is too many, but 10 is, 10 should let us know that we're in a war and we're not winning it. So those are some kind of scary statistics that we're dealing with in our city. So I'm going to turn some of my remarks over to Officer Allen. Can you tell us, what you're seeing on the street working patrol shifts, how that affects your day-to-day work as far as drug calls, drug cases, and then how does that tie into your role as a drug recognition expert?
Well, we're certainly seeing a lot more impaired driving due to the drug problem here in Laconia. Years ago, back when you started, I'm sure it was mostly just alcohol impairment is mostly what you saw. You'd probably see an occasional drug impairment, but we're seeing a lot more of that now with the prescription drug abuse, the heroin problem, and other drugs. And another thing that we've seen a lot of in the past few years is what we refer to as polydrug use, which is, you can have a person under the influence of multiple different drugs. It's not just going to be heroin. It's not going to just be one certain type of prescription drug. It can be many different times. A lot of times people are taking prescription drugs that aren't prescribed to them, so it's become much more complicated in recent years, whereas before it was usually just an alcohol impairment.
So when you talk about the specifically, you're talking about driving under the influence of a substance. Where do you see that as being different from alcohol? How is it affecting people differently than maybe alcohol would?
Well, it's still going to bring impairment. The difference is that when officers go through the police academy, they're mostly trained for alcohol impairment. In recent years, it's been 10 years since I went through the academy, but when I went through 10 years ago, it was mostly geared towards alcohol. They touched a little bit on drug impairment, but it was not taught as much. I've heard that recently they've introduced more drug impairment training. But for a lot of the officers out in the street, when they see someone impaired, they're basically just, a lot of them are thinking alcohol. So if they suspect that there is drug impairment either with the alcohol or just drug alone, that's where I come in. So if an officer pulls someone over or handles an accident where they suspect that the person is impaired by drugs or alcohol and drugs, they're going to do the same roadside tests that they would that they're trained through with the academy for alcohol impairment. Once those tests are complete, and if they have enough for an arrest, and they make the arrest, and if they still suspect that there is drug impairment, that's where my position comes in.
As a drug recognition expert, as you are seeing these people come in, as you're doing the evaluations,
Yes.
I know that heroin is obviously a big catchphrase, a big topic that we're dealing with here, not just in Laconia, and that's one of the things I want to stress is a lot of times I'll get people come up to me and they say, I can't believe how bad Laconia is. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I want to stress as we talk about these topics, we're addressing topics that are going on in our city, but by no means does that mean that it is isolated to Laconia. These same things are happening in Guilford, Belmont, Meredith. They're happening everywhere. But obviously, being the bigger city in the Lakes region, we garnish a lot of attention. But for those that may watch this, you need to understand that this problem is going on in your backyard as well. It's not just a Laconia.
Well, I think to add to that, to talk about the 77 overdoses that we've had this year that you guys have been to, there's no demographic that this matches up with.
Right.
It's males, females, it's older, younger people, socioeconomic, where they have a lot of money or they're poor. It doesn't matter. It crosses all boundaries. So when you talk about different communities, it also is in your backyard. In every neighborhood you're in, there's a potential to be there, whether you know it or not.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I've used kind of the analogy of horse blinders. We tend to think, well, I live on this side of the street or I live in this section of town, and that doesn't happen, and that's just not the case. I mean, this is attacking everybody everywhere at any given time. So kind of going back to that, Gary, if you could tell us what, there might be people out there that see this, parents, family members, that suspect that maybe their kid or their loved one is using some kind of substance. What are some things with the training you've received? What are some of those signs that that you might recognize if you were doing an evaluation for someone that, let's say, was using heroin?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, there's 7 different drug categories that we're looking at. So it's going to depend on what, category they fall under as far as what signs I'm going to be picking up on. If someone's under the influence of heroin, which is our narcotic, they're going to have, very constricted pupils. They may have slurred speech. They're going to have poor coordination. So there's very, and if someone's, someone's under the influence of a stimulant like a cocaine, they're going to have, pretty much the opposite. They might have dilated pupils. They might be excited. So it's going to depend on what drug they are on, as far as what category they're going to fall under. And when I put people through a test, I have it's basically a 12-step test that I put them through, where I'm going to be checking their pupils. I'm going to be doing physical tests as far as walk and turn, one leg stand. Some of the tests that I run through are the tests that people see on the side of the road. Some of the tests are going to be the same, but mine is a little bit more in depth. I'm going to be checking them for blood pressure. I'm going to be checking their pulse. So once I go through the entire 12-step process, that's where I make my determination of whether or not they are impaired, and what to do at that point. Now, just because I get called to do a drug evaluation, it doesn't always mean that they're impaired under drugs. I've done an evaluation where I found out that someone could be suffering from a medical condition. Sometimes they could. And by the way, it's important to mention that when someone makes the arrest and they bring them back to the station, this test that I put them through, it's consensual. The person has to consent to this test, because at that point they are under arrest.
Right.
So it's not like a roadside test, and so any officer can put them through the roadside test, but once they're under arrest, they come back to the station. That's where we will determine whether they or not they want to consent to this test. And once I put them through the 12-step process, then I make my determination of whether or not they are actually impaired by drugs and or alcohol.
Okay. Chief, kind of going over to your side of it, what are some of the issues that your guys are seeing, men and women are seeing, as they go to these calls that may be drug-related, alcohol-related? What are the concerns that you see as someone who's overseeing these men and women as they go out?
Well, one of the concerns that we see is the repetitive patients. We'll see the same, it's not uncommon for us to see the same patients over and over again, and that's concerning for us, because if they're fortunate enough to survive through an overdose, and they overdose again, their chances could be running out that they're going to be successful at that. And that's concerning to us, because, we take a lot of the safety of the citizens personally,
right,
and we want everybody to be healthy, and we want them to, to get the treatment they need. And when we see it not happening, it can be mentally challenging on the firefighters and the EMS providers.
You also, the other side of that is, and I know that's kind of where the Laconia Police and the fire department have worked hand in hand for years, is one of the issues is just the safety of your paramedics as they're going in. And a lot of times you get into combative situations.
We're very fortunate here, and I'll make a great plug for the relationship we have between the police and fire department in the city. It's awesome. We always have you guys with us when we're responding to a lot of our incidents, and these ones we always have you guys with us. But yeah, a lot of these patients, no matter what drug they're on, and you talked about the multiple different types of drugs, they can be combative, either from when we first get on scene or from when we revive somebody. It's not uncommon for us to have a combative patient, and that obviously taxes the personnel there and puts them at increased risk. So it is a concern for us. It doesn't deter us from doing our job, but it certainly is something that we have to be careful about.
Now, I want to go back to kind of the taxing on the departments. We don't have our chief here, so I'm going to kind of rely on you for this information. When you started many years ago,
yeah,
I'm assuming there were less firefighters on at the time.
Yeah, we actually, we only had 7 on duty at a time. We're up to 9 now, so that's been great because the department and the city in general is just busier.
Right.
We have a lot more calls in total, let alone calls like this.
One of the things I think is interesting with I want to be careful how I phrase this because I don't want your chief or my chief to get any phone calls. But one of the problems that people maybe not recognize is that with the increase in drug activity, with the increase in criminal behavior that may be associated with a drug activity, that causes attacks. So the people are thinking, well, it doesn't really affect me. It does. It affects you right in your pocketbook because if the city has issues, we have a responsibility to respond to those issues, whatever they may be, drug, alcohol-related issues. Therefore, as a necessity of that, the fire department grows, the police department
Absolutely.
grows. Not that I want, not that I'm trying to get rid of my job, but at the same time, we could do our citizens are, this we're all invested in the city. The more we do, the more we're going to alleviate some of that burden that we see in the fire department, police department. I'm gonna jump over to you, Ruth. I know you've been kind of quiet. Didn't want to jump in right away, but we're going to save the best for the last. So, as a firefighter, as a police officer, we're seeing what's happening on the road, on the street, in their homes, when life is falling apart. That worst of the worst times is what we're seeing, and sometimes we forget the aftermath.
Well, my point of interest in what I saw in my work as director of OB, and even before I was director, is we saw a kind of a steady increase in the number of babies being born and going into withdrawal. And there's this common misperception that the newborn is an addict. Addiction is a behavior. Once that cord is cut, there's no drug or alcohol getting to that baby. So the baby is now going to go into withdrawal. They often, if they're going to go into withdrawal, do that within the first 72 hours. So we see it, but we had to receive special training to recognize and do what's called NAS scoring, which is neonatal abstinence syndrome, and score these babies. If the baby scores high enough, then the pediatrician is going to start ordering medication, which mostly is going to be morphine. You titrate that up until you get the baby to the level where they're not scoring, where they're scoring where they need to be, or not scoring at all, and then you gradually titrate that down. Well, this doesn't happen in 24 hours. We're talking, a week and sometimes 2 months or longer that these babies have to stay in hospital under care, and that means 24-hour nursing in a nursery. So these babies are sick, and so if they're really, really bad, we send them to Dartmouth. It had gotten to the point, though, where small hospitals like Lakes, when we recognized that a baby was in withdrawal, they were shipped to Dartmouth. But it became such a huge issue that Dartmouth couldn't take all these babies. So local hospitals had to begin to pick up the slack and keep the babies in the community. It's a very difficult situation. With HIPAA laws, if mom and dad aren't married and mom hasn't said to dad what's going on with the baby, staff cannot say what's going on. And anything that causes a physiological dependence can put the baby into withdrawal. So the street drugs that people are taking, but even, people would come in and be taking Subutex, which is the form of Suboxone used in pregnancy, but they were taking it on the street, and they had the misperception that because it was a treatment drug, then it was going to be perfectly okay and the baby would have no problems, and that is simply not true. Methadone and Suboxone, Subutex, cause physiological dependence. Therefore, the baby has to be weaned off of it, however they're going to do that. But this has a huge cost.
I was going to ask. I mean, anybody that's spent, 4 hours at the ER with their kid for whatever, knows that when they get that bill at the end of the day, it's not, and that's,
Well, it has a huge cost in dollars, and mostly the payment of this is coming from Medicaid.
Mhm.
So not often from private insurance. So there's a cost directly to the taxpayer. It has a huge cost to the healthcare industry because now you've got to have much more staffing. Because when you take, in a small hospital like we have, we don't have a nurse that's dedicated to the nursery all the time if we don't have babies that need to be in there. But you have to have somebody in that nursery 24 hours a day. That's, in that department, 8-hour shifts. That's 3 nurses a day
right.
taking care of those babies. And often there's more than one. It's seldom that there is not a baby in withdrawal at Lakes.
In your time, 25 years doing this, have you seen an increase?
Oh, absolutely. Years ago, we didn't even recognize it. In 1991, there was a state study of meconium sampling, and and I won't go into what all of that is,
Yeah.
but they actually found that there was an occurrence of cocaine use at the time. That was the drug of choice. So, but we didn't recognize those babies back then. We just thought they were cranky babies.
Mm-hmm.
And then gradually, we saw more and more, and there was more awareness.
Do you think that obviously, as some of this is related to the fact that either agencies didn't report things because there was not a need to report, or that they didn't recognize it, like you said, and then some of it's related to just the increase of what's happening nationwide. So trying to kind of keep to that, 10 years ago to now, what do you think the rough estimate of these children are, these babies are?
Well, there's definitely been, frankly, I'm not good with remembering
Sure.
numbers, but I always kept stats on the number of babies, and each year it would go up. We'd
Okay.
have more babies.
So you'd have a
each year.
steady incline of
Yes.
the babies that are affected.
So say we had 10 babies in 2005, 11 babies, 14 babies,
Right.
and on and on. And as our testing became more sophisticated, and in this state, the doctors, nurses the doctors don't need to get parental permission to test a baby who's exhibiting signs of withdrawal. They simply have to write the order.
Okay.
Because often you would expect, and the mothers are not necessarily great historians.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, Ruth. We see a steady incline in these children. Clearly, it's an issue. What are some of the effects that we're gonna see at 2, maybe at 5 or 10?
And that's a difficult thing to say that because we can't do a randomized controlled study legally, ethically, morally. You just can't do that. Take 10,000 women and have them do heroin through their pregnancy
Right.
and say this is what happens. And since there's polysubstance abuse, so we would be looking for kids with behavioral issues, things that are now labeled ADHD, anger management issues. Some things don't show up, particularly with alcohol. Not all kids impacted by alcohol have full-blown fetal alcohol syndrome, but they do have damage to their brain. Some things don't show up until they're teenagers. And all of a sudden they have math problems and other issues, anger management. They can't think to consequences. These are the kids that show up in the courtroom for the same crime time after time because they don't get it.
In my time as a Laconia police officer, one of the things that I've seen, and I've spent now I think 7 or 8 years here at the high school working hand in hand with them, a lot of educational pieces, but certainly I think one of the things I've seen, which I think is sad, which just re-emphasizes the issues that we have in our community, is a lot of the behavioral-based issues that I'm seeing have some kind of a root in a substance abuse issue. It might not even be that student's substance abuse. It could be the substance abuse that they've witnessed. And that, that is clearly, how do you expect a kid to come to school and perform at a high level when they're dealing with things like that in their home, and that's one of those sad things that you know, I want to see eradicated. Kids shouldn't have to go through that, shouldn't have to be dealing with that. So I'm going to put each of you on the spot as we're going to finish up here, go to kind of your final thoughts. So just kind of going in order here with starting with Officer Allen. You've been on the job 10 years. You've got a little bit more time left on. What would you, and you live in this community.
Mm-hmm. Grew up here.
Grew up here, homeboy. What are some changes? What are some things that you want to see happen? What are some things that you want to see? You know, your job makes you involved, but you know, if you could reach out to your neighbors and your friends that maybe aren't involved, what would you say to them?
I think, you know, as far as the impairment issue, as far as, you know, operating a motor vehicle, that a lot of people don't think about how drugs will affect the person's ability to operate a motor vehicle. You know, when everybody thinks of an impaired driver, they think, oh, the person's had a lot to drink. But no one really thinks about the person that takes a lot of prescription drugs, or has other, you know, drug dependency issues, whether it's, you know, someone on heroin or cocaine, or even someone that smokes marijuana. All of those drugs will impair your ability to operate a motor vehicle. And a lot of people just don't think about that. You know, they might have a family member that's on, you know, 6 or 7 different medications. I mean, we've all seen people that are on even more than that. And some of these people are still operating motor vehicles on a daily basis, because and some of their friends and family might not say anything to that person because they're not really thinking, oh, he's probably impaired or she's probably impaired. So I think for me is that, you know, I would like people to recognize that there is a danger out there with all of these people under the influence of either one drug or many different drugs, and they're out there driving vehicles on a daily basis, and it's dangerous. You know, we're seeing it more and more, and although we still have a lot of alcohol impaired drivers, we're seeing more and more drug impaired drivers, and I think there needs to be more awareness of that throughout the community.
Thank you. Chief Piatti?
Yeah, you know, I was just kind of thinking about the question. I had a little more time to think about it, and it was nice. I think we need to really focus on education and recovery. People can go through the legal processes and not change. People can overdose and be saved and not change. But if we had able to build up our education and our recovery systems, which is going to be community-wide, statewide, countrywide, and we're not sure where that goes, you have a better chance of stopping the epidemic. It's not going to be through arresting necessarily. It's not necessarily going to be through being revived in an overdose.
Right.
But true education and recovery is what we need, and that's what we need to be pushing.
I have to agree that the education is huge. People, remember, I'm talking about pregnant women, they don't realize the damage that they're doing to their baby is going to last that baby's entire lifetime. Their highs will last a short time, but like with alcohol, the baby's blood alcohol level remains higher longer than mom's because the baby can't filter it out. That does a lot more damage. So there needs to be awareness, and then we need so much more in this community for recovery, for treatment.
I agree.
And not just this community, but statewide, nationwide. I mean, that's the issue.
I just to conclude, and I appreciate appreciate you all coming today. I agree 100%. Education, recovery. Our state attorney general he's on board with that. That's what they're pushing. They're pushing that we do more educational. Eric Adams, who is a Laconia police officer, that's his role: education, involvement, alternative ways of dealing with people who are involved, recovery court. There are many things going on. I would tell you, and this would be kind of my final thoughts, that as you're looking for a way to get involved, and I hope that many of you are, Stand Up Laconia really is an organization that is trying to do everything that we've talked about here. trying to get involved. We're trying to do educational pieces. We're trying to bring awareness to the topics that are influencing and impacting each of us. And you can sit in your homes and think it's not happening to me. But if it's happening in your community even once, it's going to have an impact on you somewhere, somehow. So I appreciate, again, Officer Allen, Chief Piatti, Ruth, for you coming and sharing your insight, your expertise in this area, and we hope that you will have a safe holiday as we move into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and wish you the best of a new year.